Okay, so this week we're going to be looking at The Matrix from 1999, directed by the Wachowskis. And I just wanted to do a little run through on it, a little bit of things you're looking for. I know many of you have seen this. If you haven't, that's great. Now's your chance. And then we'll be watching it together on Tuesday. So if you want, I'm also going to include the slides that I'm going through now because there's some clips that you might want to look at in more detail. If you do, you are going to have to zip through it. This is part of a larger introduction. All right, so the film itself, surely you have at least heard of. You have heard references to it. Many of the elements of it have become just part of our cultural lexicon. It is a film that was incredibly groundbreaking at the time it came out in a number of different ways, and is one that, interestingly, I think largely because it is hyper stylized, tends to go in and out of fashion. Like it remains a solid film, but it is one that people love, and then they just, the outfits are too much, or the music is too much, or something, and then it comes around again. But the core of it is very, very strong. Now, a few things just kind of about the background of it before we get into why. Why is this film worth analyzing? Just a few things about it. When it first came out, nobody expected it to do well. Keanu Reeves was not only not bankable, he was considered like not somebody to put in your film. He was not reliable, he was not interesting enough, etc. And it was, as I say here, it was dumped into the bracket after the Prestige releases around Christmas time, but long before blockbuster releases for summer. And it just, as I say there, it exploded. Suddenly, it's all anybody was talking about. So understand, when this was coming out, Star Wars Episode 1 was coming out in about a month. That's all anybody was focusing on in terms of movies. Even George Lucas then said, The Matrix just killed attention Phantom Menace could get. Part of what people also will zero in on, if you look at the zeitgeist of the end of the 90s, the turn of the millennium, there was this paranoia, this fear of, postmodernism was sort of at its depths, and this, along with, as I mentioned, their Fight Club, really captured that sense. Now, one of the things people remember a lot for it, of course, is this whole bullet time idea, which I'll get to in a second. And yes, that was influential, but really, it introduced a lot to Western audiences, especially in terms of the idea of fight choreography and making it much more ballet-like, allowing it to be sort of expressionistic and unrealistic because it is simply sort of visually beautiful to watch. Sort of the violence almost is incidental, and so forth. It also very quickly achieved a lot of people focusing on the depth of the film. And to be clear, this is philosophy 101 stuff, but considering the context, that's really pretty impressive, right? That it manages to touch on Christian theology, Plato's allegory of the cave, a lot of philosophical concepts, as well as more postmodernist questions of simulation and reality. So this bullet time idea, which is, of course, is where somebody jumps in the air and freezes in place, and people often talk about this being the first film to use it. It was not. It was the first film, though, to figure out how it could be used in a way that was narratively interesting. Prior to that, two different films that had used it, and I've got clips here, is one from Wing Commander, which don't watch it, and the other from the movie version of Lost in Space, also not really worth watching. And they both have moments that use this idea, this point where people freeze in place, but it's just sort of like, oh, we just figured out how to do it. Let's do that. And again, I think I've talked about in class, it's not actually that, it isn't that something was impossible to do prior to that. It's just nobody had really figured out how. It's labor intensive. So all of these little black circles are cameras. You just line them up in a circle, and then you carry out the action, and then you're just taking the frames you want from each as the camera pivots around. And then, of course, you've got the green screen, so you add in the background, and there you have your image. So as I say, I'm not going to play the clips there because they're just not that interesting. But if you want to go through them, you can kind of see how we figured out this cool thing. And so I think it's only noteworthy largely because I think that speaks to our relationship to our narratives. It isn't just can you do it, it's can you make it part of something that resonates in terms of story and visuals and so on. Because in The Matrix, it's part of this disconnect from reality, and it's also used to get us to see something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see in an image, and so on. So it's got, however perfunctory, a purpose. The bigger impact, I think, is martial arts. Now, Chinese martial arts films, Hong Kong, etc., they've been doing this super exaggerated, people flying through the air, impossible kicks that physics, it couldn't possibly have the impact that it does. They've been doing that since the 60s. But we, as a mainstream audience, we couldn't get into it because that's not realistic. And we couldn't see it as poetry or ballet or arts. And so we just couldn't do it. But if you look at, really, again, there's some fantastic clips here. If you going back to, even as I mentioned, the 60s, this film Touch of Zen, as you'll see in this moment, is fairly simplistic, but so as you can see there, it isn't really about does it look like it's real? It's sort of the physical impressiveness, and Eastern storytelling is heightened. It's expressionistic. It exaggerates things to the point of the beauty of it. That's Donnie Yen, who is pretty amazing, and he would actually want to get to a specific moment in here with the umbrella. He would actually pay the other actors a little bit more to actually knock them out, so it looked realistic. So this is The Magic Crystal, which is not a good film, but it has some truly wonderful, like they sort of abandoned any attempt at realism for the pure just fun. One of my favorite moments is the home invasion gone wrong. All right. Oh, that's right. I gotta use a different. Okay, so what The Matrix allowed us to do was to see this in a new way, because they were saying, oh, but it's not in our objective reality. For those who haven't seen it, I won't go into too many details. And that was enough for Western audiences to then see the exact same style of martial arts and say, okay, now I can do it. Now I can get there. And that has transformed our relationship to this idea ever since. All right, to go into the characters a little bit. Neo Thomas Anderson, and Neo being his hacker alias, this is where we start to see some of what the Wachowskis were going for. He is referred to frequently as the One, a little too much. Ander is actually a term meaning man, and then son of man. You can start to see the religious imagery starting to come through. Morpheus, his mentor, is the Greek god of dreams. Trinity then is going to be, so Trinity, of course, in Christian mythology is the link between humanity and the divine, and she is the one who's going to lead Neo from his ordinary life into this extraordinary one. We're also then going to get the Oracle, who is the spiritual guide, was a real spiritual guide in ancient Athens. Agent Smith is the primary villain. Not much to do there. And then a character named Cypher. A cipher is a puzzle of sorts. So we start to see a little bit of what they're going for there. And that's where it's interesting to start taking the film apart. Again, the religious imagery, but also the philosophical imagery of, is this real or not? There's also some really interesting autobiographical components, which is not... I don't know how intentional it was, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So some of the things to kind of think about and that we'll look at: fate versus free will. This is going to be a question that comes up a lot because fate is comforting, but then we're helpless. Free will, on the other hand, liberates us, but then everything's up to us. So the truth versus illusion. How do you know you're alive? Who are you really at your core? Like all good science fiction, it's going to touch on the Frankenstein story and so on. But as I mentioned, the autobiographical element, the filmmakers are transgendered. And when you watch it through that lens, it's a pretty interesting film in terms of the ideas that emerge. And I'm going to include a student's video essay where she tackles this question. But there are elements that pulled from their lives. If you've seen the film, a real moment is one of the Wachowskis was contemplating suicide and thinking of jumping in front of a train. And in the film, we see a moment involving almost being hit by a train. And this is when the antagonist calls him Mr. Anderson, and he asserts, no, that's not who I am. My name is Neo. And that's that's one of many, many, many examples, which I'll touch on as we go. But really, obviously, ultimately, it's just a really, really cool movie. Right. I mean, it is a valid film. It is an interesting film. But first and foremost, it's just a blast. It's a really accessible, terrific movie. Okay, that is the basics. So as I said, Tuesday night we'll be watching that on Netflix Party, and I'll include instructions on how to get set up on that. Look forward to seeing it with you.